So shalom from Israel, and thank you for joining us on another one of Yad Vashem's online lectures. Over the past months, I have met many of you on our online lectures, and I see some faces that I recognize, so thank you for joining us once again. To those who I have not yet had the pleasure to meet, my name is Jeremy Weiss, and I am a director at Yad Vashem's International Relations Division. Today we bring to you a lecture by Dr. Sharon Kangisser-Cohen titled, What Now? Children Survivors in the Aftermath of the Holocaust. Many might view the Day of Liberation as a moment of happiness. This is not the case for the survivors, especially for the children who survived the Holocaust. Following liberation, they confronted a new reality, and the reality was one that they had nowhere to go to. Everything was taken from them, their families, their homes, their communities, their friends. They had lost their childhood, and in some cases even lost their names. They were devastated, both physically and emotionally. Dr. Sharon Kangisser-Cohen is a director of the Diane and Eli Zborowski Center for Study of the Aftermath of the Shoah at the International Institute of Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. In this lecture, she will be highlighting the challenges that the Jewish children had to confront trying to survive the Nazi occupation and how they experienced after the effects of their attempts to rebuild their new lives after the war. Sharon, please. Sharon, just unmute yourself, please. Sharon, you just need to unmute yourself. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you're in, and thank you for joining us this evening. I hope that within the next 50 minutes or so, we will try and think about some issues that relate to the idea concerning the rehabilitation, or the rehabilitation with a question mark, of child survivors of the Shoah after the war. And I will start by saying that the research concerning post-war rehabilitation is in its infancy. And over the past 10 years, I would say that it's become more of a research topic amongst scholars, which is wonderful, and it's welcome. And it also talks to the fact that there is so much about the Shoah, it's the period of the Shoah itself and its aftermath, that still needs to be discovered, researched, thought about, and written about. So post-war life of Jewish child survivors has been, is in its infancy, as I can say, and has been very much developed as part of the Eli and Diana Zborowski Center at Yad Vashem, where we have had some publications on this matter, and scholars from around the world participating in discussions and research. The question of what happened to children during the war is also a relatively new topic of research. And this was primarily done after Deborah Dwork from Clark University managed to create a very, very impressive work on children and their experiences during the war, and which really pushed the whole idea of, let's think about this group of victims, the children, the Jewish child, as a separate group within the Jewish larger collective because of their age and because of their circumstance and because of their own, obviously, particular emotional and psychological stage of development, as well as Nazi policy. They suffered a particular fate. They suffered a particular fate, and therefore their experiences needed to be examined independently or separately. And what's important, what Deborah Dwork points out, is that essentially one of the issues of writing about or discovering or thinking about what happened to Jewish children during the war, for the most part, we know that the majority of Jewish children were murdered by the Nazis, is that there is very little contemporaneous evidence, meaning that they left very little trace. They left very little trace because they weren't necessarily at the age of 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 writing diaries, poetry. They weren't leaving letters. Most of them were murdered and didn't give testimony, didn't articulate what happened to them during the period itself. And the story of what happened to Jewish children during the war is essentially a story that's told by adults of children about what they remember happening to the children. And therefore, the child is not the subject as in terms of giving his or her voice, but rather is one that is told by the adult world that survived the Shoah. We do know that there were, obviously, as you know, I'm sure, diaries that were left by younger adults, teenagers, that give a glimpse into that particular experience. But essentially, the idea, also in terms of the Nazi documentation, they weren't recording necessarily what was happening to Jewish children up until the deportation to the death camps. When it became also a policy of mass murder of Jewish children, which they essentially were the first, you could say, the first victims, along with the elderly, as they were the most vulnerable and weren't seen as fit for labor. So even the Nazi documentation...
Sharon, if you could, we lost your PowerPoint, so I don't know if you did this purposely, but if not, if you could re-share your screen so we can see your PowerPoint. Thank you, and sorry for disturbing you.
No, that's fine.
You need to, it should be coming up right now. There it is. Very good. Thank you.
Okay. So
you have to scroll down. You have to scroll down to the slide you're interested in. Yes?
Yeah. So I'm getting it. So he's talking about the absence of the child experience from contemporaneous Jewish and non-Jewish documentation, and then later on after the war. But we do have some wonderful collections that are from the early post-war period, in which child survivors, who are generally defined by research as being 16 and under at the age of liberation, who were giving early testimonies as to what they experienced. Now, I cannot, in this brief time that we have together, you'll have to come to Yad Vashem for more lectures and workshops and the like. I can only give a few examples of experience, and I want to link those examples of experience to later on to talk about post-war rehabilitation and adaptation. So what are the issues that are facing children at the time, and then what then becomes the challenges that they go through? So essentially, one second, I'm trying to scroll. I'm taking a few slides of extracts from a very important collection that was done by the Jewish Historical Society straight after the war, and is essentially housed at Yad Vashem in its original, as well as the Jewish Historical Institute, and the Oral History Archive at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has translated testimonies. So this is just a fragment from a child by the name of C. We don't know any more particulars about the person who gave this testimony. And she tells the interviewer the following. Night. A weak light of kerosene lamp lights up the dusk that reigns over the room. Suddenly, I felt someone's touch. I opened my eyes. Over me stood mother, dear, unforgotten mother. I understood that the action expected since a week had come. The mediator of experience for children generally, and particularly during the war itself, is obviously the adult world, and particularly parents, if at these certain points in time as a parent was still around or surviving or hadn't been deported, to navigate a reality for a child. And what we see in the small little extract, and I'm sure that you can see other things, but the idea is that you have a domestic situation. You have a mother doing a normal thing, waking up the child, however, for an abnormal event. An event that is not about waking up to reality of getting up and continuing with the day, but an action which usually means a selection and a deportation. And what is interesting is that the child, him or herself, understands that that action means something else. They've been waiting for it and it had come. And now the function of the parent is to mediate that experience. Carolina Mateka, at the age of 4, also talks to this point. The Germans entered, and I asked Daddy why he did not take me to preschool. He told me that the war was on. I did not know what that meant, and he did not explain it at all. I did not know I was Jewish. I did not know what that meant. I did not go outside often, and I did not know why. I rarely played with children. I had one friend, and I cried a lot after she died. As again, parents are mediating a reality, and in this instance, the child is not told about what war means, the fact that she's Jewish, and is essentially operating under the same sort of traumatic situation of just being confronted with war, not knowing necessarily how to understand that, particularly at the age of 4 or 5 or 6, probably at 4 when it happens, but later on, further on. But the parent is now mediating, and in some instances, when we try to understand what children understood about the war and what was happening, it was obviously about parents, and we see in many testimonies that parents weren't necessarily explaining or sharing what is actually was happening in the world around them, and one could think about why that would be so. But children are navigating through themselves, and then after essentially a time where people are under Nazi policy are being hunted, killed, and deported, children don't necessarily need that navigation because they're seeing it or they're witnessing it for themselves. And then we have to think about how do they interpret what they are seeing and what they are witnessing. And so Rosalia Barnett tells us the following, it's not a story, it gives us the following testimony. One day I chased a cow to a pasture, and there I saw my brother. He found out that from Chianskova, where I was, and found me. He told me then that he was with the partisans. I asked him for mother, and he cried. Then he told me how our parents had perished. The Germans took them to the Jewish cemetery and told them to dig a hole. Who could jump over a ditch could save his life. The hole was very deep and wide. Mother jumped and fell in. After her jumped father, and the Germans shot them both. My brother stood behind the fence and saw it all. We both cried, and I told my brother that I will go and register as a Jew, and they should kill me too, because I don't want to be alone in this world. My brother consoled me that maybe we will survive, and he will take care of me. I ran to the house to bring him sour milk and biscuits. Suddenly I hear shots. I return, and already my brother was dying. A Ukrainian noticed him and shot at him. I washed his wounds, and he lived for 5 minutes more. What is happening for children during the Shoah is essentially, we could think about 2 major themes, amongst many, but 2 major things that I want to talk about. Number one is what Janoth Bullman, who are a psychologist in their research, called shattered assumptions. That essentially the world in which children were born, the world in which they were raised, and the world in which they understood was essentially those assumptions about how life and the world works was shattered by the Shoah. Because despite getting up in the morning or being woken up by your mother meant the beginning of a new day, now being woken up by your mother was talking about the beginning of an action. So the idea of how do we create after the war a sense for children that can basically undo those shattered assumptions. Now the world that they know has completely changed, is completely radically different. Instead of a trajectory to life, the trajectory is to death. That's the fate of European Jewry. So what do we do afterwards when those assumptions, we return to a post-war world? And the second issue, which is so important, is that essentially we know that children generally, and we talk about normative psychological theories of child's development, is that the world is mediated through adults and by adults. Children learn to socialize, children learn to mediate their reactions and their emotions. The adult world becomes a function of mentoring children as to how to be in the world. And essentially without those adults, with the adults who are now receding more and more through their murder, the question is how emotionally can a child mediate their lives, socially mediate their lives, and for the most part, in terms of the Shoah, can they, in fact, at all survive? Because a child of 4, 5, 6, 7 will not be able to manage to survive the Shoah without an adult within their realm. So it's either a parent, 2 parents, a brother, siblings, extended family, or a rescuer, or partisans, or whoever that may be. A child cannot survive on their own. And so the adult world is about physical survival, but it's also now becomes about emotional survival, how to mediate emotionally that period. So these themes of reconnecting to an adult world and the idea of reformulating assumptions about the world, or it becomes some of the main tropes of post-war rehabilitation of child survivors. Dvorak Freimet. We were poor before the war, but now after father's death, we had nothing at all to eat. When we moved to the ghetto, we had our furniture, but in this room where we had to live, there was no room and the furniture was in the courtyard. I and my siblings were glad that we were moving. There was great enjoyment for us to take the furniture and great things out of the apartment, different things out of the apartment, sorry. My mommy cried a great deal then, and she said that we were going to our death. She buried the best we had, the Passover dishes, because she thought that maybe one of us children will survive and will take these things, perhaps. Mommy was sick constantly from worry. My older brothers had to carry her to the ghetto because she could not walk to our new apartment. Other Jews could gather staples, but we had no money. Mommy and the children were swollen from hunger. What children who managed to survive the war then also have to deal with is those images of their parents who had become, for the most part, increasingly weak or sick, unable to necessarily sustain themselves and the families that they had. For the fact that essentially starvation was rampant, it was a policy, and what we have are those images of children having to look and remember their parents as people who unfortunately weren't able, no longer able, to keep them alive and to keep themselves alive, and children becoming adults or taking on roles in order to sustain the family. I'm going to move on from this slide for the moment. And I want to introduce you to the story of one particular survivor who's still alive and with us today, survivor by the name of Yehuda Bakon, whose work we've dealt with a lot at the Zborowski Center. Yehuda Bakon is born in Czechoslovakia, in Meresh Ostro. He is deported to Theresienstadt with his family, and later on deported again to Auschwitz-Birkenau with his family. One of his sisters had managed to leave Czechoslovakia before the beginning of the war, and he arrives essentially to Birkenau and is placed in the Czech family camp at Birkenau itself. At some point during the deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, Yehuda Bakon is working with a few other boys in the camp working. They are basically schlepping stuff all around the camp, all different types of materials, including, building materials, wood, feces, bodies. And Yehuda Bakon asks the Sonderkommando at some point, and I'm just making it very simple, but it's a very long, complicated testimony, if he could basically see the inside of the gas chamber and the crematoria at Birkenau. And according to Bakon, the member of the Sonderkommando that he had met and become acquainted with, Kalman Fuhrman, asked him, why, you're a child, why would you want to go into the crematorium and the gas chamber? And he says that if I survive, I need to tell the world what I have seen. And he doesn't say that in his testimony, but in a sense, he sees it as his obligation. Yehuda Bakon is an artist. He sees the world visually. He takes it in visually. And he basically, essentially starts sketching right after the war what he had seen, and particularly these pictures, these drawings from 1945, which become the basis of post-war trials, proving essentially that the gas chambers and crematoria existed in the way that we understood them to exist. So we have a picture on the right of crematoria building and the picture on the left of the inside of the gas chamber itself. And I'm bringing this slide because I want to talk to the point is that we have children who are entering this space of, well, this world of the death camp. And for the most part, the majority of them are murdered. So any small voice that we have from that place or those places, or any survivors from that is rare. Yeah, there's nothing more to say, but it's rare. But what is interesting is that what happens is that survivors, adults, and even young children start to believe, to have their important notion that they need to bear witness, that they might not survive. But if in the off chance that they do, that they have an obligation to tell the story of what happened at these sites. And that becomes another very important post-war trope for children, and I'll get to it later on. But we see children are confronting not just the beginnings, which are awful, whether it's anti-Jewish legislations, to ghettoizations, to deportations, to labor camps. There are children who are witnessing death camps and even the crematoria of Birkenau. So after the war, the question is, of the 150,000, which is estimated by the JDC, the Joint, after the war, the 150,000 children that were essentially counted as being still alive, out of the 1.5 million children that was a pre-war figure, people are trying to think how and in what way can we help? What can we do with this miracle, with this, essentially the hope as well of the Jewish people, because they were young and they could rebuild lives and they could restart life. And obviously the most important thing was to deal with was the issue of health. There was children and survivors generally, but were suffering from a whole host of health issues, from dysentery to all sorts of terrible, malnutrition, getting them back. And that was ultimately the first objective, healthcare services. And there was an important book by Rachel Herzog that's just been published by Yad Vashem, dealing with the healthcare system and also of doctors who were survivors and later on doctors who worked in the newly state of Israel. So the issue of medical health, Ada Shine, and also important scholar dealing with issues of health. But I want to talk about something different, because I think I touched on it in my former slides, which is really the idea of what about the emotional and the psychological world of child survivors? What about how to help children deal with the trauma of what they'd seen and try and help them figure out a way to rebuild or move forward, rebuild shattered assumptions, regain a trust in humanity, choose to be members of humanity and not choose to leave it. And what's interesting, it's not such a black and white question, because even if a survivor, for the most part, decides, I'm going to live and I'm going to rebuild and I'm going to have all of these positive, in a sense, a trajectory of rejoining life, it doesn't mean to say that with throughout those years, that after liberation, that they didn't still contemplate suicide, didn't deal with depression or fight depression, all sorts of behaviors that as a result. So even though we can say we have so many that have rebuilt, we also know that even within the same person, that's not necessarily a constant path. Now, the JDC, which was really probably the most remarkable organization after the war, in terms of it being an organization across denominations in the United States, in terms of jury, and managed to raise funds and really became a lifeline for the survivors after the war. Thought about, okay, we're dealing with health and we deal with education and we'll deal with physical conditions, but what about the emotional world of the child survivors? And what they did is essentially commissioned a psychologist, Dr. Paul Friedman, who had come from Europe. He wasn't an American. He was an immigrant, and he was a psychologist who basically became an expert in suicide later on. But he was employed by the Joint to essentially go to Europe in 1946 and visit European countries in which there were child survivors living in different types of institutions, whether it's schools or orphanages or DP camps, and basically write a report. What is happening to children emotionally? Because we need to understand, as the Joint did and as Friedman did, that if we are dealing with a group of people who might be physically rehabilitated, but if aren't emotionally rehabilitated, they can in fact not necessarily sustain themselves into the future. So Paul Friedman travels to Europe and he writes a report and he writes a series of articles. And his observation, which is quoted here, that comes from one of his articles in Commentary in 1948, he says, children, they all gave evidence of an incredible physical and psychological resilience. But I soon discovered that these children had serious emotional problems, usually of a neurotic nature. They would have been distinctly abnormal not to have had them. He understands that you cannot emerge from this black hole without having been affected, that there are scars and there are wounds, which is normal to have after having experienced such a disaster. And so he's saying we need to figure out how to help. Interestingly enough, we have Lena Kuchler, a survivor herself, who is called in Krakow by the Jewish Committee to establish essentially an orphanage in Zakopane for Jewish children who had now been orphaned. And she says, well, one of the issues is, and she gives in her testimony, it's a testimony from Yad Vashem that is based on an earlier interview, that says there were absolutely no suitable people. We're talking about, she's called to create an orphanage, but she's saying there were no suitable people. There was no one. I picked out a certain group of women who had returned from the Lager Auschwitz. These women had lost everybody. They had lost their husbands. They had lost their children. I said to them a few words. I told them that if they do not have their own children to take to their hearts, these children who do not have parents, we should become true mothers to these children. This will be the aim of our lives. Who is there to look after the children? Most of the children are orphaned, either orphaned from both parents or orphaned from one. Whether or not their families had managed, who had lived overseas, to relocate them, or, as we know, in terms of children who had been in the hands of rescuers, some of them are brought back and some of them were never reclaimed for all sorts of reasons. But Lena Kuchler says, fine, we need to look after these orphans. We need to look after these children, but who's going to do it? And who's going to do it? These traumatized women themselves who've lost their own children. These are the people that we have. And so what does it mean looking after children who have survived when you've in fact lost your own? Paul Friedman goes around and he creates this report, and it's the sources in the JDC archives and the Geneva collection, and we've got a copy at Yad Vashem of the report. And he goes on and he gives case-by-case details of what he sees as happening to children. What he sees is going on. And he gives countless examples. So, for example, he's in France, he's noting that one of the issues that they're dealing with is soiling, incontinence. There were some cases of uncontrolled diurnal soiling. For example, a 3-year-old boy was placed in a home because his mother, a returnee from a concentration camp, was sent to a tuberculosis sanitarium. The child, who cried all the time, repeating all day long that he wanted to go back to his mother, began soiling himself. Each time he soiled himself, he was being punished by being sent to bed for the rest of the day. Paul Friedman's conclusions, essentially, from his 6-month journey in Europe was the carers of these children really weren't equipped, even if they had been through the war themselves, and maybe even more so, but he doesn't say that in such words, to deal with and to help these young children. They were the only ones available. They were the care. In France, he was talking about members of the resistance who took over the children, and said they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the skills. And what was most difficult is that it was not just about responding to behavior. There was a very gross disconnect between what children were presenting in terms of the behaviors and their stories and their past. And he's saying, if you understand what they went through, then you can help them, or then you can treat them. But you can't rely on a parental or a model or a psychological model where you're essentially responding to the behaviors and trying to change the behaviors without thinking about what these children have actually been through. So Paul Friedman, so far, the various problems of the children seem to have been utterly neglected. At no time has there been any attempt at individual understanding. Although at times devoted and intuitive, the supervisors failed to see that the methods were wrong. Now, we know that there are survivors who left testimonies are amongst us that claim that if it wasn't for the people around them after the war, that they wouldn't have been able to survive the post-war period. So on the one, we have Paul Friedman saying we have a lack of skilled care in terms of dealing with children of trauma. And yet we have to understand at the time in the 40s, how much was there that was written about how to help children with trauma. Anna Freud was developing as a result of the war, but we don't have a corpus of child psychology that's trauma, how to deal with the children of trauma. So we have to keep a perspective. But we do know that there are many individuals who are in Europe and later in the States or later in the new state of Israel that do have maybe not necessarily always skills, but know how to help. And I return to Yehuda Bakon because Yehuda Bakon is essentially a young boy who is orphaned at the end of the war. He loses his mother, he loses his father, he loses his sister, and he comes back to Czechoslovakia and he comes back to Prague and he knocks on the door of the synagogue in Prague, and it's opened by a man who says, I've just come back myself from the concentration camp. I can't help you, but I know who can. A man by the name of Peter Przemysl, who has used castles around Prague, in which he is bringing in children who are victims of war, children who are Jewish and children who are not Jewish, children who are Sudeten children, children who are German children who have been displaced. And he gathers them around, and basically Yehuda Bakon says, and in his painting, which is one of the exhibits in the museum itself, is that this is what restored him. This is what reversed his shattered assumptions. This gave him the reason to live, was through the work and the love and the guidance of Peter Przemysl. And he titles his painting, To the Man Who Restored My Belief in Humanity. It wasn't something that children could do alone. It needed to be mediated by mentors or educators or people around them who were able to relate to what children had been through and listen and hear their stories, and then on the basis of that, help them think about ways for them to move forward. But what Bakon is saying throughout his work, it's not just what he taught me in terms of skills or continued to encourage his drawing. It was that his behavior as a person, in terms of a human being, in the way he treated the children around him, became a figure which restored his faith in humanity. Yehuda Bakon is saying the example I have is Birkenau of people, of adults, of abusing people. Those are the images. And he said, but even in Birkenau, I would find an SS who sometimes was kind. There is kindness in everybody, even an SS person in Birkenau. However, it's the model with the mentoring of mensches, of people who are good and kind, that ultimately say to me that yes, the world does have goodness. And therefore, on that basis, despite the challenge and difficult, I will commit to being part of the world. And it might not necessarily be a big figure like Peter Przemysl, who is recognized by the Righteous Amongst the Nations. Here, Paul Friedman talks about the fact that there was another child of 4 whose parents had been deported, was placed in a home for deaf mutes during the German occupation. She stopped talking after 6 months. Following liberation, she was given to a foster mother, a pianist, and by profession, who gave the child piano and singing lessons. The child's speech and hearing was soon restored. So the sad irony is that it depended who looked after you, who picked you up after the war, which home you went to, who looked after you, what kind of person were they? Were they an example of humanity? Were they had an intuition of how to help? And that, for the most part, which is so sad in terms of child survivors, the ones who survived, it was really a matter of luck as to who are the people that were actually going to look after you after the war, and therefore give you probably the best chance you had of emotionally, but also physically surviving and rebuilding a life. And one thing that's also crucially important is that for child survivors, that they needed to be with other child survivors for the most part. That essentially, not necessarily child survivors, but children generally, but particularly child survivors were able to not necessarily communicate what had happened, but they all knew that they'd had what they had gone through. And so Perla Freitag, who's the sole member of her family, she ends her testimony in the following way. I entered the children's residence at 25 Norwich Street. I like this place very much. I'm with many children. We work together and study together. Here, I do not feel so lonely. I'm no more depressed. Rehabilitation is forming bonds of belonging and chains and communities of belonging. The war disrupts family life. It tears people apart, and essentially survival for the most part is a singular soul activity. You are surviving on your own. Children are surviving obviously with adults, but most of them survive the war, and they, for the most part, have lost so many and sometimes are the only sole members. The way that children are able to be rehabilitated is by reconnecting. So whether it's with a mentor who they can connect with and who are compassionately showing them a path, or through children's groups or children's institutions, they need to feel a sense of belonging in community and no longer alone. As we know, psychosocially, children need to be in community, but so much so after the war when they can no longer survive as individuals and as orphans. Now, the interesting thing here is that why I bring this is because Paul Friedman is in conversation with Louis Pasternak, who's another Vienna psychologist from Vienna, who's saying children need to be rehabilitated with other children. And Friedman is saying, no, children need to be rehabilitated in a family structure. And there's a very big debate within the psychological world, big debate. But there's a debate as to what is the best way to go about it. Is children's homes, youth aliyah, kibbutzim, or do children need to be in families in a nuclear normative environment, and what is the best way? And we can see that there is this debate. And one could say that it's very hard to evaluate what is the best option. The question is, what is the quality of care? Because in either situation, you could be faced with a very difficult reality or a wonderful reality. As I said, it really was the luck of the draw. And so I want to end this presentation at this point and open it up for questions. And just leave by saying that we're talking about, as I said, reconnection, and rebuilding or rethinking about a world in which the assumptions that were a child was born into were shattered, and how do we help the children after the war still believe that it is worthwhile to be part of the human project. And that is really in the hands of carers, and it's really in the hands of education and of educators. And it's really one of the, I would say, few legacies that we have of the Shoah. Because if we think about children in trauma, which unfortunately is still part of our world, we have to think about how to help children with trauma. And the Shoah and its after effects does give some sort of learning model to help us understand that a child cannot rehabilitate him or herself alone, and that the level of care and the nature of care, and more importantly, connecting to their individual story, is vital for them to be able to start the road to not a full recovery, but a recovery in which life can still be embraced and enjoyed. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Before I go through questions, I would just like to reflect on something you said. Obviously, the ability to treat these children immediately after the war upon liberation was limited. So it took time, sometimes weeks, months, and maybe even longer. Paul Friedman, you said, only came in 1946, so that's significant time after liberation. My question to you would be, has there been done any research, and if so, what were the results of trauma coming up, not immediately after, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years after the liberation?
Okay, so that's a good question. First of all, it's a question that's an advert because in September we are hosting an international workshop on the psychological rehabilitation of survivors generally, not specifically just children, but generally after the war, because it's an area that really was brushed on but not investigated enough. So at Yad Vashem we've got a seminar from scholars from around the world who will be looking at different psychological and emotional therapies, treatments that will not be available. However, we know that the research that's been done has really been done with adult survivors, and not with child survivors. Because for the most part, after the war, except for these depositions that I'm showing you and some testimonies, for the most part, children did not speak about their experiences after the war. They did not give formal testimony. They weren't, for the most part, asked formally about what they'd experienced. There were different projects, they were small, but child survivors generally were a group of people who, for the most part of their lives, up until the age of around 60, unless they were survivors, for example, Yehuda Bakon, who becomes a witness in the Eichmann trial because of his drawings, were people who were not asked necessarily, and also felt that they didn't want to tell their stories because they wanted to become like everybody else, and they wanted to be immigrants, and there's a whole lot of reasons why there was a silence around child survivors. And the only thing we can have now is with later testimonies, which we do have a lot of, because as they aged, they began to speak. And as the older generation of survivors had passed on, the next generation began to speak. And we know from our experience, the survivors that we've been hearing speak to us one-on-one for the last 15 years were children during the war. So that whole speaking about what happened is really much, much later. And so we have to do research on that, but keeping in mind that that will be research that's based on someone's memories that is, 50, 60 years old, them reflecting on that period. I mean, even 1946, these children are reflecting, even though they're still reflecting on what happened to them. But now they're reflecting at a much larger gap, and we need to take that into consideration.
So today, when we encounter survivors who are now in their 80s, possibly a little bit older, in the 90s, do we still see traumatic, specifically at an elderly age, that are related directly to the children? One of the questions that came up was addressing that. And are these people getting any specific help which are related to that? A question that came from the audience.
Sure. Children it's interesting because on the one hand, children were given an opportunity to rebuild their lives. They were liberated, and they had their whole lives ahead of them. However, what I mentioned before is that the foundations of their lives were shattered. For an adult survivor, they had 20 years, 30 years of living in a normal world when people behaved normally. A lot of the time, young children were born into just on the cusp of chaos, or just beginning to be, and their foundations of what is normal is really not there. And the question, it was much harder for them to then think about life after if you don't have the foundation. Just for the small example, but parenting. If children lost their parents at a very young age, they didn't have a parenting model when they had their own children. So there were delays in their experience, or gaps in their experience, and then later became difficult when they reached those milestones. Now, we know the work of Judith Kestenberg, which began in the 80s, which is a phenomenal work, which she basically recognized a group of second generation. Child survivors, not second generation. She started to interview them in a remarkable collection called the Kestenberg Collection, psychological questioning, to see the effects of trauma. And what she developed was a whole theory of a therapy of essentially helping them fill the gaps. For example, one of the things that they used to do is they would gather together in groups, and that's why it's so important, the idea of collecting, sharing your experiences. They would have child survivor support groups in which they would play childhood games, or they would have a pajama party, or they would have a pillow fight, to try and reclaim those parts of experience that they had been, not allowed to have, so to speak. So she was trying to restore that. Now, her whole work then led to a whole child survivor therapeutic model and practitioners. One of them, the most Judith Katzenberg is no longer alive, but one of her students and then later one of the co-workers was Eva Fogelman, who lives in the United States, in New York. And the therapy became widely available. Every stage of life or every milestone could trigger a traumatic memory and a flashback, which might lead to some sort of difficulty emotionally. We know that survivors who didn't speak for the most part of their lives, at some point they had some sort of traumatic intrusion or some memory, which all of a sudden reminded them that in fact it was still there, it was still with them, despite the fact that they had survived and overcome. And we know that there's been a lot of work that's been done about what would help survivors in their older parts of their life deal with these childhood traumas. And one of the main things they talk about is the idea of telling your story, becoming a witness, feeling that your story now has meaning because now you're an educator and you're passing on to the next generation. Writing your memoirs is a way of giving a frame to the chaos of trauma. So speaking and retelling has been a very, and also we know survivors with talking to groups, traveling with them to Poland or to Germany. As they become survivors, experts or educators, they're able to feel that the experience has meaning because they are passing it on to the next generation. So there are all these different models of, but we know that there are some who might be fine and might be well and not necessarily all the time and find it difficult, especially when they're aging and they find themselves increasingly vulnerable in their aging process.
So we have many questions. I'd like to address just two more, and to those who are unable to address the questions to Sharon, please do send your questions to the email that has been provided on the chat. But two questions that came up in different angles from the participants. One had to do with sexual child abuse, that obviously is additional abuse or additional trauma to the total overall trauma that already the family or the child went through. So that was a question that came up from different areas. And the second question that came up from several of the participants in different manners was the fact that in many cases the parent himself died and then reunited with a child or was through the war with a child. He himself or she herself was in trauma, and now the child was growing without being able to really deal with his own trauma because of his parents' trauma. So these two things came up through the questions.
Okay, great, thank you. In terms of sexual abuse, there's a lot of work that's been done recently looking at issues of sexual abuse. Mainly, they didn't necessarily talk about children as much as young women, and it all depends. Look, we know that sexual abuse is part of the unfortunate realities of war regardless, and that it was rife during the Shoah and even after. But in certain, especially when we're talking about, these ideas of the Russian soldiers coming in and raping and pillaging, all of these images, sexual abuse is there, and it's always there, and it's unfortunately with us in human history. In terms of children, is that it's whether or not the children were asked about it and whether or not they were willing to talk about it. And I interviewed a woman about 15 years ago and who talked about the fact that she was abused by her rescuers sexually while she was hidden in France. And she never told anybody. She didn't even tell her husband. And after decades of marriage, one night she started to have a very difficult dream and got very upset and turned around to her husband in bed decades later and told him the story of her sexual abuse. And it's got to do with the fact that society wasn't able to hear those stories. They didn't ask those questions. And people weren't willingly offering that, especially children who might necessarily even know at the time what was happening, or if it was wrong, or if they should speak, or if they could speak. Very, very complicated. Judith Katzenberg's testimonies do deal more with issues of sexual dysfunction as a result of trauma. I haven't looked at all 1,500 testimonies, but I'm sure at some point someone is going to bring it up, but it wasn't something children spoke about or could even articulate or felt that they could articulate. So we don't have that much in research on that matter. The second issue is, yes, we've got a very important concept called Generation 1.5. Child survivors are survivors themselves, but they're also members of the second generation. They are members of the second generation with all that means in terms of having parents, if they're lucky, one or two, who themselves are survivors and carry the trauma of what happened to them to the war. And so they are in this really difficult situation of their own past and their own trauma, but also their parents. And sometimes their parents are functioning and sometimes their parents are not functioning. And there, I would say, is a lot of pain and trauma from that, of returning to, or being returned or reunited with parents who aren't able emotionally to take care of their children anymore. And also, there's one instance that is a testimony by a woman called Sally Wasserman who lives in Canada at the time, currently, who was from Poland, who was placed in the care of a very loving rescuer, and whose aunt reclaimed her after the war, and they had an awful relationship after the war in Canada. And her real sense of, why was I taken away from a carer that I loved and that I was connected to, and to an aunt who had so much difficulty dealing with the fact that I was the only survivor of her whole family from Poland, and the relationship was very difficult. So we have all sorts of stories, but yes, Generation 1.5. You're a survivor, and you're also the children of, and you have to deal with both stories.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the many questions that we're unable to address, and I do ask those who have the questions that were not addressed to please send them to us, and we will share them with Sharon, who will get back to you as best as possible. It's a very disturbing lecture, very professional. I thank you very much. As a second generation, I live this, and I understand, I don't understand. It's extremely traumatic. And once again, never again, never again. And thank you very much. Thank you for all the audience for participating. And let's stay strong in our beliefs and in our moral abilities to have a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shalom.